This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. The city of Belleville, Illinois, was founded nearly 210 years ago. To this day, it remains the most populous city in the Metro East. And it comes as no surprise that Belleville and the people who've lived there have played a large role in the state's history. One former Belleville resident is Gustave Koerner, a German immigrant who fled from his homeland in 1833. In the United States, he became an attorney, journalist, judge, politician, and diplomat. He was known for his anti-slavery views, and he was a confidant of President Abraham Lincoln. Now, there are renewed efforts to restore the Belleville house where Koerner lived. And that's the topic for today's show, the history and the home of Gustave Koerner. Here's producer Alex Heuer.
In downtown Belleville, a few blocks southeast of the square and its signature fountain, is a two-story house. It's at the intersection of Auburn Street and Muscuda Avenue and sits along a brick road. Outside of the home are two signs. One reads, Koerner House, circa 1854, restoration underway. The other is a plaque that notes that the home is on the National Register of Historic Places, a designation the house achieved in the early 2000s. The house is a tall two-story building in the Greek Revival style. It's an off-white color, and on the front of the building, there are 5 windows. The shutters are dark green, and there's the wooden door. A brick sidewalk leads up to it. Jack Lachine and Molly McKenzie are the longtime co-chairs of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee. They met me at the house, and I had a chance to talk with them inside in the back parlor. Jack Lachine, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for coming by the Gustave Koerner house.
And Molly McKenzie, it's nice to meet you as well.
Well, thank you. You're welcome.
A house was initially built here in 1849. It was rebuilt in 1854 after a fire. And here we are sitting in what used to be the back parlor of Gustave Koerner's home. And I want to get into the history of the house and the restoration efforts in a bit. But I first want to talk about who Gustave Koerner was. Gustave Koerner was born in Germany in 1809, and he came to the United States when he was in his mid-20s. Jack, why did Gustave Koerner leave Germany?
He was a rebel, and Germany was fractured at that time into small states, and Koerner and others who attended university joined a group called the Burschenschaft, and it was a student group that aimed at creating a new Germany. So these crazy college kids decide to overthrow the government in various cities, and they try to coordinate their efforts, but the police get wind of it. So as Koerner and others are trying to take the police station in his hometown of Frankfurt, the police show up and there are shots fired. Koerner gets wounded in the arm. He has to flee. He escapes town dressed as a woman in a carriage driven by his friend Theodore Engelmann. He then goes to Switzerland and eventually to France to come to America. But he was an activist at an early age and just wanted to make his mark.
Why did he decide to leave instead of fight for what he wanted Germany to become?
There was a crackdown, and it was called the Schwarz Book, the Black Book. His name was entered on it, meaning he would be hunted by the police for this activity, this illegal activity to try to overthrow the city government. So he had to flee. Otherwise, he would have been put in prison with others who were captured.
Molly, what do you find most remarkable about Koerner's story before he came to the United States?
Well, we think of him as a rebel, but he truly was a freedom fighter in Germany and trying to organize these smaller German states into a republican government. So scholars in Germany today look at Koerner as a freedom fighter.
One of the things that Gustave Koerner is known for, as I mentioned, was his anti-slavery views. And this is at a time when people were still enslaved in Illinois. This is in the 1830s when he arrived. Jack, what was Koerner doing in the years leading up to the Civil War? We're talking about nearly 3 decades before the Civil War started, but what was Koerner doing here?
As his party, which is the Engelmann family, and they established themselves in 1833 just outside Shiloh. They buy a farm there. Koerner is among this group. He is not a farmer. He makes that clear. He wants to get into either journalism or he is a lawyer, but he's trying to find what he's going to do here in this country. So he proceeds and becomes a lawyer and becomes involved in politics. But those first years out on the farm, the Engelmann farm, were quite difficult for him. He decides to walk to Jefferson City, Missouri, he and a friend, to see what the situation is in Missouri. Of course, Koerner is anti-slavery. Missouri allows slavery. So he wants to see what the conditions are there. And a man named Godfrey Duden had written a book describing Missouri as basically a land of milk and honey. Koerner didn't believe that, and he is trying to persuade immigrants to come to Illinois because of its non-slave status. So they walk all the way out there, they walk all the way back, and Koerner writes a response to Duden, basically saying things are not so great in Missouri. You would find life better here in Illinois, a free state. So he's trying to influence immigrants to come here, and they do come in the following years.
So Gustave Koerner goes to Jefferson City. He doesn't like Missouri as much as he likes Illinois. He has quite a remarkable couple of decades leading up to the Civil War, in which he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1842. He was a judge on the Illinois Supreme Court and became lieutenant governor from 1853 to 1857. Jack, how did he achieve all of these things?
He had a superior education compared to frontier lawyers who, I think the case on them is argued from an emotional point of view to sway a jury or a judge, where Koerner had a very fine German university legal education. Little anecdote we tell is that when it was time for him to pass his courses in law, he was grilled by 4 professors for 4 hours in Latin. When he came to Illinois to get his license, he goes to Vandalia. There's 2 judges who are staying above a tavern. Koerner and some others who were applying to be in the bar go to this room. One judge is sick. He's kind of laying on the bed. And after about a half hour, they go, okay, yeah, you guys are good. They go downstairs and have a drink, and Koerner travels the 60 miles back on horseback.
What was the practice of law like back then?
Well, I think a lot of it was collecting debt, property disputes, of course, divorce and others, but it was, and criminal law, which Koerner also practiced. But one of the things that he takes advantage of on his way up is a man, James Shields, who is a very interesting character in himself. Shields is also very active. Koerner at one time said he held more government jobs than any man he ever knew. But Shields gets on the Illinois Supreme Court. After a year or 2, he has enough and he decides he would resign. But he gets Koerner to be his replacement. The legislature approved that. Koerner had been a member of the legislature, so they knew him. So it's politics, but it's also being on the right side of issues. He fought for the rights of immigrants. He did some representation of enslaved people or indentured people who were trying to establish their freedom or challenge their indenture. He did that without charging them. So he and Lyman Trumbull and others are active in this fight before the Civil War to help poor black people and at the same time be a part of what's happening in the world of politics.
Molly.
I think it's important to point out that Illinois was settled from the south to the north. So the concentration of the population and the politics and the wealth and power are coming from the south to the north. So the first capital is at Kaskaskia, the second capital is at Vandalia, and the third, of course, Springfield. So, things are moving through this area first, and a lot of the power structure is coming from southern Illinois.
So Gustave Koerner is a politician, of course. He becomes lieutenant governor, and that's a high position in the state. Why was he interested in making the jump from attorney to politician?
There's some crossover in picking up legal clients. I don't think that was his main idea, but he wanted to play a role. And Belleville enjoyed a golden period beginning. We had some of the earliest governors were right here in town. John Reynolds, Ninian Edwards, the lawyer that Koerner associated with as a lawyer, Adam Snyder, was a candidate for governor in the 1830s. So there was a lot of politics. People are moving up from Kaskaskia, Cahokia. The Southerners, as Molly mentioned, are coming up through the river system, and things are moving kind of fast. So Belleville, at that time, played an important role in state politics. Chicago later develops, but in the early days, it's a small village. And then there's Springfield, Galena, some other towns. But Belleville played a role, and to be here was to be part of the action.
That's Jack Lachine, who, along with Molly McKenzie, is a longtime co-chair of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee. They're talking with producer Alex Heuer on location in the house where Koerner lived in Belleville. It's a house that's considered the most historically important home in Belleville, Illinois, a city more than 2 centuries old. We'll have more of that conversation in just a moment, including how Koerner met Abraham Lincoln, and later we'll detail the renewed efforts to restore the home. Let's return to producer Alex Heuer's conversation with Jack Lachine and Molly McKenzie, the co-chairs of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee in Belleville. Koerner was a German immigrant who fled his homeland in 1833. In Illinois, he became an attorney, served on the Illinois Supreme Court, and was lieutenant governor. He later served during the Civil War and became a diplomat. There are renewed efforts to restore the home where he lived in Belleville, a house on the National Register of Historic Places built in 1854.
One of the eye-catching facts about Gustave Koerner is his association with Abraham Lincoln, and particularly his role in the 1860 presidential campaign. Gustave Koerner is described as a confidant of Lincoln. He would eventually be a pallbearer in his funeral. Jack, how did Gustave Koerner and Abraham Lincoln meet?
Koerner's memoirs recall in the campaign of 1840 when Abraham Lincoln was a Whig and campaigning for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Lincoln appears at the courthouse on the public square to speak. Koerner's law office is right across the square in the northwest quadrant, and he's interested in politics. So he goes over and he wants to hear this man. And typical Koerner, he gives a description that he had no roseate hue about his face, and that he seemed kind of somber and not morose, but just didn't seem to have much energy until he started talking. And then his voice elevated and his arms were used in his speech making. So early on, he has a picture in his mind of Lincoln. Later, when Koerner is on the Illinois Supreme Court, Lincoln is in Springfield, he's arguing cases, and Koerner at that time says all the judges began to appreciate his droll sense of humor in arguing cases, and he appreciates Lincoln for his ability to be a lawyer, but he also knows that he has a real grasp of politics and how you get elected. So they proceed from there. They later are co-counsels on some railroad cases. I think Lincoln was not as well versed in some of the complications of that type of law, so he asked Koerner, who had a superior education to Lincoln, for help. And they worked on a few cases. Then in 1855, this party emerges, the Republican Party, after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would have allowed slavery to expand into territories. And both Lincoln and Koerner are of the opinion, we can't have this. We can't attack slavery through the Constitution, there's no mention of it, but we can't allow the expansion of it. So that is the boiling point where they both meet and decide we have to form another party. We have to be a voice of those who will not allow the expansion of slavery.
And so what did Gustave Koerner actively do during that campaign of 1860?
He spoke all the time. And this was, a sacrifice for a guy who has to schedule his cases. He has to be in court at certain times. So to be out on the campaign trail, going sometimes even to Indiana or northern Illinois, it wasn't just in this area, but he's very active supporting Lincoln. He speaks in German to one crowd. Then he may speak in English to later crowds. And these rallies would go on for hours, and there would be a list of speakers. So he's out there spending his own money to support his candidate, and it proves his dedication to the cause.
Spoiler, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidential election. The Civil War begins in 1861, and Gustave Koerner, he receives an appointment. What does Gustave Koerner do during the Civil War?
He is assigned as an aide to General John Fremont, whose base is in St. Louis, but then they go out to western Missouri and engage in some battles. Fremont was criticized for being a pretty free spender and listened to some bad advice from some people as to what to do. So Koerner, I think, was of two minds at that point, that he wanted to be involved, but it seemed Fremont was not the right person to be attached to. Koerner has a problem with his eyes at that time after several months out there, and he returns because of his health, and that's pretty much the end of his military involvement. Although he does organize a German unit, the Koerner unit, 43rd Illinois, that the Germans wanted to show their patriotism, and Koerner wanted there to be such a unit, and he asked Lincoln, can you accept this? And Lincoln, and I think this is one of my favorite responses, he writes back, well, we just don't really, this is at the beginning of the war, April, May. He said, we really don't know who's going to respond. He said, we could have everybody respond that we've issued a call to, or none. And at this moment, I can't tell you whether we need you or not. Please understand my embarrassment. Well, Koerner waits a couple more months, and the Illinois governor authorizes formation of the 43rd Illinois.
Molly, what would you like to add to this?
Well, that Koerner succeeded in getting the 1860 Republican Convention located in Chicago, which was home turf for Koerner and Lincoln, and that he was the floor manager, if you will, so to speak, at the convention in Chicago. And in fact, there's a telegram that Koerner sends to Lincoln during the convention, and Koerner simply says to Lincoln in this telegram, "Don't come here," meaning I'm handling it and you don't need to come here.
I'm talking with Molly McKenzie and Jack Lachine. They are co-chairs of the Gustave Koerner House Committee. I want to touch on the latter half of Gustave Koerner's life a little bit later on, but let's turn to the house where we're sitting now. The first version of this house burned down just a few years after it was built, and it was built in 1849, rebuilt in 1854. Molly, what was the house like after it was rebuilt from the fire in 1854?
It was built in a very popular style in America at the time, the Greek Revival style. There's a side hall on the at the entryway, and the main block of the house is 2 rooms deep, or double pile, as it's referred to. There's a back service wing where all of the domestic chores took place. The kitchen, the prep room, food prep rooms, and doors going out into the backyard where a number of animals were kept, a milk cow and chickens and that sort of thing, for the family sustenance.
The house rebuilt in 1854. At this time, Koerner was lieutenant governor of Illinois. Is it fair to say that he was someone of means and that this would have been a very nice house at the time?
Well, I think it was a nice home, but yet a modest home. Koerner was a very practical man, and he was raising a family. As Jack mentioned earlier, he was politicking on the side and taking him away from his work as an attorney and a judge. So he was very mindful of his resources, let's say, but indeed a very practical man.
We've been talking all this time about Gustave Koerner's official life, that he was lieutenant governor, his association with Abraham Lincoln. What was his home life like? His wife, her name was Sophia, and I know that they had several kids, but what do we know, Jack, about what living in this house might have been like?
Well, as you can see, of course the audience can't, Koerner was not one for pretense or ostentation. He, in fact, took some embarrassment as a politician if he was considered to be ambitious. That in those days, you didn't reveal your ambitions. You managed them through your friends. So he's a bit of a different person in that respect. And his house, as I say, does not have a lot of filigree or doodads or ornamentation. But as far as living here, they early on had servants, and at one point 2 servants who stayed at the rear of the building in a small bedroom on the first and second floors. And eventually one of the servants become so fond of that they adopt her, and she is mentioned in the will as receiving some money. He, at one point, as far as living here, his cow wanders off in the late 1830s, and he places an ad in the paper describing the cow. And this is kind of common. Animals are roaming around. There are no local ordinances at that time. So he finds himself trying to get his milk cow back because of he needs it for his children. So it would have been a busy corner. It would have been on the outskirts of town at that time, near downtown, but still almost in the country.
What can you tell me about Gustave Koerner's wife, Sophia?
When they leave Le Havre, France, Koerner has just fled Germany because of his student activities as a rebel, and he decides to join the Theodore Engelmann party. They're about ready to take off for America. Sophie is with the family, Sophie Engelmann. So they were familiar with each other because Koerner's best friend was Theodore Engelmann. So he was around Sophie, but on the trip coming across the ocean, I think that's the beginning of their romance. Then, of course, they get here and they live out on the farm. Sophie describes that period as very hard work, a lot of real drudgery. They have to grow things. They're on their own in a new land. She was a very faithful companion. She later becomes involved in establishing the kindergarten in Belleville for young people. This is a 1876-ish era. She's known for that. She's also known for having a very large floral garden on the east side of the home that took up much of the yard.
Molly, anything you want to add?
Of Koerner's children, two of his sons died before adulthood, and one, in fact, was at West Point, passed away from some fever. I'm not sure that they know what happened to him, and he was buried at West Point. So when Koerner becomes ambassador to Spain, they are traveling from Belleville to Spain, and they go by and through West Point to visit the grave of their son. So that's kind of a sad tale, but their son was buried, and they had no closure until they visited many, many years later.
That's Molly Mackenzie, who, along with Jacques Lachine, is a longtime co-chair of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee in Belleville. They're talking with producer Alex Heuer on location in the back parlor of Koerner's home. When we return, we'll talk about renewed efforts to restore the house in Belleville. Built in 1854 and on the National Register of Historic Places, it's been deemed the most historically significant home in the Metro East City. Let's continue with producer Alex Heuer's conversation on location with Molly Mackenzie, who, along with Jacques Lachine, is a longtime co-chair of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee.
Gustave Koerner dies in 1896. He lives a long life. Jack, what happened with Gustave Koerner's life after the Civil War? He still has some 4 decades of living after the Civil War, but what does he primarily do over that time?
He's still very active, very concerned. His Republican Party begins to change. And in 1872, a group called the Liberal Republican Party emerges to challenge General Grant's presidency and some of the controversies connected with that. So they form a separate party. There are some Democrats who join because they disagree with Grant as well. The party does not do well, but he stays active. He starts out as a Democrat. He becomes a Republican. After the Civil War, when the Grant administration creates these issues, he goes into the Liberal Republican Party and then finally goes back to being a Democrat. And the short interpretation of that is that he's a man of principle, and although he's tied to a political party, he's not averse to challenging what he has done and creating a new path forward. He's independent and committed.
What do we know about what happened to this home in the 20th century?
After Koerner's death, there's, I believe, maybe a year lapse or so, but then a a wealthy attorney, William Winkleman, buys the home, and he buys the property behind it as well, which at one time was owned by Gustave Koerner's son, Gustave. That's Gustave A. So it early becomes a two-family. It has addresses as 200 and 200A, Abend. So it was rented upstairs and down. Then later, a lady buys it, and she also rents out the upstairs. So it was a two-family for a long time, and then in 1985 becomes cut up into 4 apartments, and in 2000 it's put on the market for sale, and that's when the city was able to buy it.
What kinds of changes, Molly, did the house undergo during that time? Because that's quite a bit of conversion.
Well, the conversion really only took place on the interior. There's not been very many changes to the exterior other than enclosing a corner of the exterior in order to accommodate bathrooms and modern plumbing. There were alterations to the side porch, exterior side porch, but mainly it was the interior that was altered in creating 4 small apartments. And when I say small, they were 2-room apartments. There were 2 apartments downstairs and 2 upstairs, which when the city acquired the building in 2001, we, as a team of volunteers, deconstructed all of those apartments. So volunteers removed all the modern amenities, the bathrooms, the cabinets, the kitchens, the shag carpet, everything 4 times. 4 water heaters, 4 bathrooms, 4 kitchens, etc. And it was all done by volunteer labor.
So you're telling me that Gustave Koerner did not have shag carpeting when he lived here?
That is correct.
Why did the city acquire the property?
There was a grant that was available from the state to seek out and purchase the most significant historic building in Belleville. And quite a lot of research was done early on, and it was determined that the Koerner House was Belleville's most significant building that needed to be preserved.
This is a big question, but what is the value in preserving this building?
That's a very large question. History matters because it is our foundation. It is our identity. It is our touchstone. It is the heart of every community. I think there's a lot of avenues to explore in that question, but basically it's our foundation. History and historic buildings give us relevance today.
Jack, you seem to have an encyclopedic knowledge of Gustave Koerner and his life and the 19th and 20th centuries. For you, why is it important to keep this house here, to restore this home?
Well, Koerner's life here is 60% of the 1800s. He gets here 1833 and dies 1896. He is a big part of our local story, the growth of Belleville into a German immigrant community. It becomes 75-80% German by around the 1900s. Some of that can be credited to Koerner and his efforts to send information back and write columns that appeared in German publications. So he plays that part, but I think more than that, it's he's a man of character. And
I can see you're getting emotional.
He touches me. He really does. So it's his dedication to doing the right thing, being a leader I think he is the prototype of the type of citizen you want. And he spends his life energetically pursuing his goals. He's the statesman for the city of Belleville in this period. He's important because of the German immigrants he influenced, the role he plays in history in fighting slavery, his relationship with Lincoln. All these add up to a great story.
If I could add, I think Koerner was a man of conviction, and there's a quote that we often use in some of our materials, printed materials, from Koerner, and he said, "Do right and fear no one."
When it comes to restoring this home, it's not as easy as maintaining a yard, even putting on a new roof or securing the foundation. There is a lot that goes into restoring a home. It costs a lot of money. Molly, what has gone into restoring this home?
We have secured the exterior envelope. The foundation is stable. We have remediated lead paint. We've tuck pointed, put a roof on, built chimneys. So the exterior envelope is pretty much complete with the exception of the porch, which is our next item on our agenda. The restoration of a building that is owned by a municipality, that's owned by a government entity, is somewhat held to a higher standard. Because it's a National Register property, we have to have all of our plans and intentions reviewed by Belleville's Historic Preservation Commission, and then also at the state level by the state historic architect with the Historic Preservation Agency. So we have a lot of people looking at what we're doing and reviewing things to make sure that it's being done correctly. Your average homeowner doesn't have to maintain the standards of disposal of asbestos. If we disturb the ground, we have to have an archaeologist present. So certain things like that, for example, prove that we have to maintain a higher standard in our approach to the restoration.
Molly, what is your dream for what this space becomes?
We're looking for it to become a public use area. We don't intend for it to be a house museum furnished with pieces that we probably could never find that belonged to Gustave Koerner. So that kind of eliminates the prospect of it being a house museum. But we certainly can use the space for telling Gustave Koerner's story of his life and his career, and then making it available to the community for events, social events, receptions, and that sort of thing.
What about you, Jack? What's your dream for this space?
Well, it is to interpret Koerner's career, his impact on history. That's what we have here. We have 200 years of history. Some people don't appreciate that, and it's a kind of a constant position to keep making that this is important, that we maintain these neighborhoods, that we maintain a historic property, and especially one such as Gustave Koerner, who was a very prominent figure in the 1800s, and we feel compelled to tell that story.
We're sitting here in the back parlor, which is no surprise, immediately behind the front parlor. And I can very much see this as a space that would host a cocktail reception, maybe host a meeting. There's something about being in a place that is old, that is just surrounded by history, that is charming, but is also meaningful. Molly, what do you see? What's a kind of specific event that you see happening here?
Well, with the restoration on this level, the first floor, we will have a small kitchenette area for serving food for, as you mentioned, a cocktail party. We plan to have an outdoor patio area where an event could spill outside into a nicely landscaped and lit ambiance area. There will be restroom facilities. So all of the creature comforts will be taken care of as well. But we hope to have, the look and the feel of these parlors restored to how Gustave and Sophie saw them, so that, if they walked in today, they would recognize these spaces. And through our studies, we know the paints and the flooring materials and the wallpapers, and we'll be able to do that and have these nicely appointed rooms where the community can use them for social events and meetings and such.
To restore this home, it's going to cost a lot of money. And I know estimates on how much things cost changes, but what do you estimate at this moment? How much money would it take to get to what you're talking about?
We're probably looking at $500,000. And I know that's shocking to some people, but if you're aware of the cost of renovations today, of the cost of construction and workmen and materials and supply chains, you'll understand that, when it comes down to heating and cooling and plumbing and, interior finishes, that's probably a very realistic estimate.
And we said in the beginning of this conversation that there are renewed efforts to restore the home. And one of the new things about what you're trying to do is the city of Belleville is helping with identifying, applying for, and managing grants. How excited are you about that? Jack?
Well, it's the way forward. Our experience in trying to do trivia nights and other events, maybe you can make $3,000 to $5,000 an event. But when you're looking at a $500,000 potential budget, you can see that that's going to take about 100 events. So we are convinced, and I believe the city is as well, that large amounts will move this forward, and that is grant writing. There is money available. There are wealthy people who will give money. They want to know that it's a good cause, and that's where the skill of a grant writer comes in to establish the credibility of your project. And we are concerned after 20-some years that we want to see the end of this, and when it comes time for us to pass this project to someone else, we want it to be on a secure footing so that whatever work remains can proceed. But getting grants is the answer.
And the city of Belleville, we mentioned, acquired the property in the early 2000s. They've helped maintain it. And really, since the city of Belleville owns the property, certainly they bear some responsibility, if not the lion's share of responsibility for restoring the home. Molly?
Well, we look at it as a partnership, and they have resources that they can lend to us. A grant writer who's on the staff with the city and has been helpful in many ways in the past, and we're going to engage him even further.
Jack Lachine and Molly McKenzie, thank you so much to each of you for joining me today.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your interest.
Thank you for coming by to see us.
Molly McKenzie and Jack Lachine are the longtime co-chairs of the Gustave Koerner House Restoration Committee. They spoke with producer Alex Heuer in the back parlor of Koerner's home in Belleville. The house, built in 1854, is on the National Register of Historic Places, and there are now renewed efforts to restore the home. Koerner was a German immigrant who fled his homeland in 1833. In Illinois, he became an attorney, served on the Illinois Supreme Court, and was lieutenant governor. He later served during the Civil War and became a diplomat. He was also a confidant of President Abraham Lincoln.
This episode was produced, recorded, and edited by Alex Heuer.
This podcast was mixed and edited by Alex Heuer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.